What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Eat, Train, Prosper. Today's episode 179, and we are talking mind pump and the big five. So back in April of 2024, we had an Instagram Q&A episode. It was episode 153, and we addressed a question around the big five in kind of strength standards in a pseudo comparison to like hypertrophy standards. And there was a little bit of controversy that came out around some of our answers. And what's kind of even funny is in that answer, which we'll play a snippet later in the episode, I even said we should probably do an entire episode on this, because when you're limited in the depth of a response you can give in a Q&A episode due to time durations, some things can kind of, slip through the cracks. So we're going to explode this one out into a full. But before we get into that, as always, Brian, do you have updates for us?
I do. Yeah. So the update for me right now is mostly around my low back, which I've updated you guys in prior episodes. I injured it doing leg curls of all things on December 26th. And then we went on vacation and I had a really, really, really bad low back injury for the first 5 days of my vacation. It's progressively gotten a bit better. It's kind of been like I'll go 5 days and it'll feel better, and then it'll become the same. What's the word I'm looking for?
Stagnate.
It'll stagnate for a number of weeks. And then like just yesterday, I feel like I made another jump in improvement, but it's been really frustrating and like so weird that a leg curl would be something that could put me into such a deficit and make me feel so old. Like nothing has really made me feel like I've aged 20 years overnight, like having a low back injury like this, where it's bilateral. I have to be cognizant every time I bend over or make any quick movements. But ultimately, like now we're almost 4 weeks in and I can do most stuff once I'm warmed up. So if I warm up, I'm a hero, which again, I think plays into like what it feels like to be 60. Like you're probably just like, yeah, I'm still good, but I just got to warm up thoroughly. Whereas a month ago, I could just jump in and start doing RDLs at 135. Now I'm like, oh, empty bar for like 4 sets and then maybe 95 pounds. It's been frustrating. But one of the interesting things that came out of it is that I haven't really trained legs super hard for 3 weeks up until a few days ago. And I was expecting going into this leg workout that I would have diminished performance. I was like, oh, I'll just drop 80 pounds off and match reps. And like, it'll just be like my first reintroduction back into training legs again. And I was doing my like back supported hack squat machine. So it wasn't an impact on my low back at all. And as I was warming up, everything was feeling so good that I ended up going up to the working weight that I was using before my low back injury, which was 580. And before the back injury, I had made 580 for 5, then 4, then 4. The final set of 4 was for sure 0 RIR. I almost failed it. 3 weeks of not training legs and a low back injury, and I got 580 for 555, and I even had 1 RIR left on the last set. So somehow not training legs for 3 weeks and being injured meant that I had improvement in my hack squat that dwarfed the improvements I was making before, which would be like a rep a week or something along those lines. Only thing I can really make of it is that I needed to recover, and my strength therefore was manifested in that performance. It does make me start thinking even further about the frequencies that I'm using. And you guys have seen me go from high frequency, higher volumes, moderate volumes, to really low frequency, low volume over the last 8 months. And now I'm feeling like maybe even lower frequencies. I mean, I don't want to become Menser-esque in the way that he went from advocating 2 times a week full body programs to full body once every 3 weeks before, he passed away. I don't think I'm going to be on what?
So what are you going to do with your time?
I know. I'm not going to be on that extreme, but I do just find it interesting. And it's something I more just need to kind of keep my eye on, as far as maybe lower frequencies happen to be better for strength. Maybe they're not better for hypertrophy. Maybe there's a kind of intermix of the two things happening in there. Like, it's really tough to say. I think it's something we look to explore in this episode as well. as we talk about the big five and kind of the interaction between strength standards and hypertrophy. So maybe that's dangling a little carrot there. Last update for me is that the new podcast I just started, Life Reflected podcast, finally was able to get my first episode recorded after, sickness through the holidays and scheduling conflicts and stuff like that. We knocked out a just over 2-hour episode this weekend. I'm working on another project as well that is centered around movement and the importance of movement in our lives, extrapolating out beyond just exercise, but just moving our bodies. So one of the ways I really like to start my new podcast is to discuss this idea of movement with each guest and how they incorporate movement into their lives. It's also a great kind of icebreaker to get the guests feeling comfortable. So I really like this as kind of a nice feature of this podcast. So Greg and I spent, 30 or 40 minutes just talking about movement and exercise and the way we move our bodies and its impact on our mental state and things like that. And then we progressed into the topic of the day, which was around extroversion and Greg's super ability, which is that he is essentially a super connector. He's the guy that's the glue of our friend group and keeps us all together. And he's got so many attributes that make him desirable as a friend. And so I wanted to really dig into that and kind of how he became the man that he is, why he is so unique and so awesome. And I think that we really did it. Like, it was just a really cool episode of two friends chatting. And I think there's a lot of value that can be presented to others. I talked a bit about my nature to be a bit more introverted and how that contrasts with his extroverted nature. So anyway, I'm really excited to get that out there. I don't think we're going to be releasing an episode a week or anything like that, but it's just a cool, fun project for me to focus on. And I look forward to getting you guys the first episode here in the next few weeks.
Yeah, that'll be cool. I'm looking forward to listening to that and just hearing a different side of you. Like, every time we speak, like, you and I speak in one direct lane, even in our like Instagram chats and stuff. Like, we speak in the same things we talk about on the podcast. So that's cool.
Thanks, man.
Am I up?
Yeah, you're up.
So, I mean, for me, it's since last Monday, it's Tuesday evening now, my time. Since last Monday, my life has been 100 miles per hour. And it was a perfect storm of just life finding a way to happen. So what it really started with is we had the first kind of big marketing event for Undefeated Gym, which is the second pro camp that Jackson is hosting, where there's 20 IFBB pros from literally all over the world. No Americans this time, I don't think, but like Australia, the UK, various parts of Asia. One person is Russian. Like, it's really, really cool all over. The gym, we just finished the training floor for it, and it's a big, cool thing going on. So we were like, knew that was coming in. Like with anything, people miss deadlines, and our final equipment order got held up in customs, and we were told that it wasn't going to make it. And that obviously had us like pretty bummed. And then last Tuesday, I checked the tracking number, and it was like through customs. And I was like, holy shit. And I messaged the guy and I was like, hey, can we make this work? And he was like, I was going to surprise you tomorrow if I got word. And they handed it over to the shipping company on Wednesday, right? And we need it for Monday morning. Now, granted, all of this equipment, we learned our lesson because we decided to put the gym on the second floor, and there's no windows or anything like that. The machines have to go up the stairs, right? And we learned our lesson from our first order. All the equipment came fully assembled, our first two orders, and it was absolute hell carrying machines up 2 flights of stairs, right?
I honestly couldn't even imagine. Like, what do you even do? How do you even, like, 4 guys, 5 guys? What does it take?
Like 8.
Yeah.
8.
Yeah.
So we shipped it unassembled, which reduced our shipping costs significantly also. But then we had to put it all together. So I get word from the shipping company, and they're like, on like Thursday, like delivery Monday morning. And I'm like, no, that cannot happen. Like, we have all these pro athletes here, like camp is starting. They cannot come on Monday. It needs to come on like Saturday or Sunday. So we're going back and forth, and I'm getting like very, very frustrated. And like Brian, you and I talked about, there's just a difference in like culture. We're in, here, it's a little bit more like island time, and deadlines aren't really deadlines, and dates are more like suggestions sort of thing. So I'm getting like really, really frustrated, and they're saying Monday morning. And I'm like, if it gets here on Sunday, like I think we can get it done. And it's a significant, it was all of our dumbbell racks, 4-station cable, seated hamstring curl, a shoulder press, an incline press, hammer strength high row, hammer strength low row, hammer strength seated pec fly, and 45-degree hip extension. So it was like a significant bit of kit. So I told our local business partner, I said, see if we can get the phone numbers of the truck drivers, the guys actually driving the trucks. And he did. And I said, I'll give him like $2 million local cash, which is about like $250 if they get it here Sunday by lunchtime. And he called him and he was like, yep, truck driver said they'll be there Sunday by noon. And I was so pissed off. I was like, you're telling me like this whole thing was over this like $250, thing. So they made it on time. Everyone got paid. We had to unload it all. And then me and one of our partners here, Jordan, we spent literally 12 hours that day building equipment till 1 a.m, Sunday night. And then went back last night after I did all my check-ins to build the final piece. But it was a very, very long few days. There was so many hands-on, but the gym came together. Everyone at camp looked really, really pumped about it. And I'm pretty excited about this amazing like facility that we have almost ready to go. If I'm being really selfish and honest, I just want to fucking train in there. I've not trained all week. I had like 2 times where I'm like, I'm going to get there early before everyone comes and I'm going to like get a training session in on, of course not. Like people get there early. There's a bunch of problems and like, I have not been able to train, but tomorrow I'm going to train.
Nice. Well, dude, I can just say I'm super excited for you. I know this has been a long project for you over the last almost 2 years at this point since inception of the idea. And I can also empathize 100% with everything that you just described, because in our, building of the CrossFit gyms over the years, we had 1, then we had 2, then we consolidated into another one, then I moved to a different one. Literally, we've moved CrossFit gyms 4 times, and that involves the entire moving of the equipment, building of the equipment, cutting the mats, building this, expecting that to arrive that doesn't come, the whole gamut of emotions and late work nights. And I mean, the whole thing. So I'm really amped that you finally got there.
Yeah. It's pretty cool. I'm very excited. I'm excited for people to come visit and be able to put some more, photos and stuff up once we're up and running.
Sweet.
Yeah, and that's the big one for me. And one thing I will say, I've kind of found myself in this period of my life where I have a lot of time on my hands, aside from this past 8 days, like 0 time. Most time I'm really done with my work week by like Wednesday evening of like the things that I need, my weekly deliverables I need to do. Client questions and stuff come in, pretty much 7 days per week, but that's maybe an hour or 2 per day, something like that. So sometimes I find myself like kind of bored and looking to spend time productively. And it was very interesting this week. I mean, I was just full out. Last week, Monday and Tuesday, I had full days of client check-ins. I scheduled a tattoo appointment in August because the shop is like really popular and busy. And I looked at the wrong month and I was like, yeah, those dates work. Wrong. It was Monday and Tuesday. So like my busiest days of the week, I had tattoo sessions from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., which was horrendous. And I do not sit as well as I did when I was 20 years old, however long ago. And then I was like up at 5 doing client check-ins till 8, till I had to get a car, 45 minutes to where the tattoo shop was. I got tattooed all day and then a 2-hour car ride home and then check-ins till 11 p.m. And then it rolled right into Wednesday. I need to be at Undefeated to do work there. So tonight is like the end of it. I can sleep in a little bit tomorrow and I'm really, really looking forward to it. But it has been fun in retrospect to be like, I only have 4 hours right now. I need to get as much work as I possibly can done. And I've had like hyper focus and it's been pretty cool because I typically have a lot of time. So it has been nice to see like how much I can really get done and be efficient.
That's actually something that I think is of high value. When I went to do this kind of introspective trip for myself to Costa Rica in early December, where I wanted to kind of, figure some stuff out, one of the things I realized while I was there is that it's been a long time since I've had a day where I felt like I just worked so freaking hard that, you finish the day and you're completely exhausted, but you're appreciative of what you accomplished, I just haven't had one of those days in a long time until I did that trip and kind of came up with these new projects that I want to work on. And I think that that's something that's very important in people's lives, is to be able to have those days where you're completely exhausted. You almost like in it, you're like, man, I'm working so hard, I need a break. But then you push through, you get through it. And there's so much self-efficacy and value in kind of looking back on that and reflecting on what you accomplished.
Yeah, I agree completely. Like some of the days where I'm like, it's Friday, I have no work to do. What am I going to do? Like, I hate those days, I truly do hate them. And it seems silly because the goal has always been you work, you get this like time freedom, financial freedom. And I feel empty trying to find something meaningful to spend it. And I'm not just going to go sit at the beach or something like that, because I really don't enjoy that. So it really is, you just find more projects to keep you like fulfilled. Is what I found.
There's just a real quick parable that I think is fitting here, where, there's a fisherman, and every day he goes out and he catches 2 fish, one for his family and one to sell, so that he can, have enough money to do whatever he needs to do that day. And this guy comes along one day and says, oh man, like I have a solution for you. We're going to get you, this big boat. We're going to get you many fish. You're going to get really rich. And the guy was like, okay, cool. Like, why am I going to do that? And the guy's like, so you can have all the free time you want. And the guy's like, well, already I get 1 fish for my family. I get 1 fish to sell, and I have all the free time that I want. So, it's like at some point, bigger is not always better. But also free time can be unfulfilling as well. And so I think there's an important balance between those two.
Definitely. And that's it from me, I think.
Cool. Well, let's play that clip from the last episode and then kind of jump into some comments there and I don't know, defend ourselves, add some context.
Definitely. So here we go. Clip is about 3.5 minutes, guys.
If you were going to rewrite the T Nation article on strength standards for beginners to advanced, but with hypertrophy movements, what would the standards be? Any initial thoughts?
I wouldn't. I think they're not helpful. I just like, this is one of those things where I think that like handicaps people, and they start chasing these things that are not like actual, they can be proxies, but they're not like super helpful. For example, right? I have pull-ups in my program right now. I use some D handles. I have like actual pull-ups. You know how many pull-ups I can do? Like fucking 8. Like, I'm not even joking. I can do like 8 fucking pull-ups, right? I'm quite large and jacked. I've been training for 20 years. I can do 8 pull-ups. There was a point like 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I could do 18 pull-ups, but they're not providing the stimulus that I get out of these 8 now. And I just think you have like, if you do have like hardcore actual strength goals, then pursue those. But oftentimes these things, if someone really just like, I just want to be jacked and feel good and look good, with my shirt on or my shirt off, things like this detract people from what their goal actually is. So I wouldn't rewrite them because I don't think they help, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think that this question is asked about strength specifically. And when you talk about hypertrophy, strength isn't the goal. And we've seen this a ton with, people like Nunez, or he has a client who's the WNBF bantamweight champion of the world. And these guys literally can get so much out of 15-pound lateral raises that I think it would be wrong to say, no, you're not strong because you're not doing 35-pound lateral raises or something along those lines. With hypertrophy, it's about what you can get out of the least amount of weight possible. And so it's almost the antagonist or the contrast to say, how strong can you be or do you need to be? Because actually the person that probably gets the most hypertrophy is the person that can create the least fatigue by using the lowest weights, but still get themselves to work that specific muscle to failure.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like we could do a whole episode on this sort of stuff. I feel like these things just kind of confuse people and cloud people's understanding of what their goals actually are.
I think a lot of this goes back to Mind Pump, and Mind Pump has such a big platform, and they're so big on the big five. Like even after that episode with Lyle, I had 2 people contact me and be like, well, Mind Pump says the big five are the most important and blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, I don't know what to tell you. Like the big five are just not important. And Mind Pump either is putting out this message because they think they can speak to the most general population people by getting them to get into the gym and move weights, and that these movements, you know, they hit a lot of muscle. So, hey, there's benefit there. I was talking to someone else about this, and they were saying that they think that Mind Pump has literally just dropped the ball on staying up to date with current research, and that they're still stuck in a 10 years ago time frame where they're promoting these archaic ideas. And so I kind of think this falls into that same category of just that things have changed and our perception of what it takes to gain muscle has changed. Cool.
Yeah, really well put.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think the first thing I want, there's a few things I want to say. The first thing I want to say is that the note that I made about Mind Pump being archaic or not up to date with the science or anything like that, that was something that I noted in that episode came from a conversation I was having. So it's not, I don't completely disagree with the statement, but I'm also not as bullish on that statement as the person that I was speaking with. Because for full context, I think that anyone listening to this episode or anyone from the Mind Pump chat group that explored this back in April or whenever that chain appeared in the group, is that I got my start with the barbell basics. Literally the first 3 to 5 years that I trained was I actually would call it the barbell sevens or the basic sevens. The 2 of them aren't barbell movements, but I would take the barbell 5, which are back squat, deadlift, bench press, overhead press, bent over barbell row. And I would add in pull-ups or weighted pull-ups and dips or weighted dips. And I would say those I consider to be the basic 7. And those basic 7 were the basis of my training routine for the very beginning of my training until I reached probably intermediate, late intermediate, even early advanced status. I was still doing all of those basic movements as part of the centerpiece of my routines, even up through college when I was more or less the same size and muscle makeup that I am now with, slight variations. So you could even argue and say I got the majority of my benefit or my growth and my strength through using these 7 movements. So I'm not trying to sit here and argue that those 7 movements are archaic or that science doesn't support them or anything like that. I have a number of kind of responses that we'll get through over the course of this, but I think that the number one important thing to keep in mind is that this podcast is made up of me, who has 27 years of training experience, and Aaron, who has over 20 years of training experience at this point. It's extremely nuanced and contextually dependent on achieving hypertrophy. We spend very little time on this podcast talking about strength. And you can build hypertrophy with the barbell movements. You can also build strength with cable movements and more precise exercises that target specific muscle tissues. But as you become more advanced, your room for error decreases. And there's also more of a cost associated with being less precise with your movements, in that there's a lot of muscle tissues that are trained by these big barbell movements that, yes, train the muscle you are looking to train, whether it be your quads in a squat or the chest in the bench press. But there's also a lot of systemic fatigue that comes along with moving big weights across large ranges of motion in this manner. And by being more precise and targeted with some of your exercise selection and straying away from the big 5, you're able to create a much more significant stimulus to a specific target area while also decreasing the total systemic fatigue, meaning that you can likely then do more volume. And so for somebody that's extremely tied into this hypertrophy world and trying to optimize the last few percentage points of their journey, that's extremely relevant. For somebody that just wants to be really healthy, be strong, have some hypertrophy, probably perform well in their flag football league with their friends or something along those lines, absolutely no problem with the big barbell basics. And so kind of extrapolating out the nuance and context in between those is I think where we're going to head with this episode for the most part. What do you think?
I mean, I think what you just stated is pretty much a nutshell of what Eat, Train, Prosper is, what we set out for the project to be, and what we spent the last 5 years doing. Like, if you're 150-pound male who's like really, really has no muscle, you're just turning of age, and you're like, hey, I think I want to do some resistance training because I think I want some muscle on. You're not going to go join the fancy hypertrophy gym with all the old like Body Masters and in Prime and stuff like that, because it's probably $120 a month and you don't want to spend that money. And you don't even fucking know if this is something that's really going to be a commitment for you. Yes, go to the local gym or put the used barbell rack in your garage and you have the big 5 and you will progress. But it's like with anything else, when you're starting out, like when you were like, hey, Brian, I think I'm going to get into riding bikes. Did you go out and buy the like carbon fiber fucking track bike that costs $10,000? No, you started with like a bike. And like, this bike has the pedals. It's going to get me around. If I find that this is a worthy investment of my time, I will graduate to a new bike that's going to be maybe a little bit more tailored to my limb lengths or customizations and that sort of thing. But it's a natural progression of anything, right? Mm-hmm. Any hobby or commitment that we get into. And one of the things that I think is important, and I feel very samely in the strong way that I did in my answer in April. What is your goal? And that's what's really, really important. And I think when you talk to, your friends or people who have done this for a very, very long time, almost everyone graduates from, the number I have here is like 3 to 5 of the big 5, right? And I think that statement says something, except for powerlifting, right? The big 5 is going to be a lot of your bread and butter because that, again, is strength performance sport, not hypertrophy. But people find that, hey, when I'm using the barbell bench press after 10 or 12 years, like my right shoulder gets really, really angry with me. And then if it's hurting, I can't go train because I have injury. But if I use the seated cable chest press, where I have degree of freedom at the wrist, at the elbow, at my pressing arc, I have no shoulder pain. It's a much better option. So like with most things in the beginning, it's fine because you just have to invest enough time to determine if this is going to be worth a worthy investment of your time and hobby that you stick with. Mm-hmm. But eventually some tools get a little bit dull for an individual per se.
Yeah. One of the biggest reasons that I would say I'm anti Big 5 at the moment, and has been progressively trending that way since, I don't know, the last decade or so, really has to do with how barbells lock you into pronation, meaning that your hand is overhand, your palms are facing down the entire time. And while that was not a problem for me in the earlier years of training when I was younger and more resilient, my older body with more miles on it really does not enjoy being locked in pronation for any exercise across the spectrum of the entire body. The bench press, man, I feel like it might actually be helpful to go through and talk about some of the issues we have with each of the individual Big 5 movements and why we might want to improve upon those. So, so if we start with the bench press, one of the problems, so a pronation being just a staple idea, but the bench press with the barbell, it doesn't converge at all. And so this is, I think by saying that statement that Mind Pump was 10 years behind the science, like I know that wasn't my statement, but I did like kind of validate it by saying it. It's a wrong statement. Like, it's not true. There's nothing scientifically wrong about doing the Big 5 at all. I think where I was leaning with that is more of this idea that like, hey, we now know, not that we didn't before, but it's become more to the forefront that what the pecs do is that they adduct, that the arm, they allow the arm to come across the body in some manner. What the barbell bench press lacks is the ability to adduct the arm across the body, which you can do with dumbbells. Dumbbells also lack, because even though they adduct and they allow you to go from wider to narrower, they don't have any tension in the actual chest muscle at the top of the rep. So when your arm is locked out over your chest, even if you went wide to narrow, you're unloaded at the top. The barbell has the same problem. So not only does it not converge, it also has no tension at the top. So if you think about pronation being something that may or may not eventually cause you joint issues, and for me, this would be up the line from the wrist to the elbow to the shoulder, like one of those three joint structures usually kind of tells me that it doesn't love what I'm doing when I barbell bench. And so then if you can find a movement that's more friendly to your joint structure and converges, so think of like the cable chest press that you mentioned, or there's a number of different machines out there now that also, start wide, come to narrow, and there's full tension on the chest throughout the entire range of motion. Those movements are just going to be more conducive to the hypertrophy stimulus while causing less residual fatigue onto the joint structures and the system as a whole, as compared to the barbell bench press.
Yeah, it's one of those things, like, I didn't even really think about it, but as you just mentioned that, like, I chose all the equipment for Undefeated. We have 4 chest presses and a fly. All 4 of those chest presses converge, right? Because when I'm looking at things, like, there's certain things, like, you spend enough time knowing, like, okay, I'm buying a chest press. I want one that converges, obviously, but I didn't even think that. I'm just like, oh, I'm going to buy that one because I know it has a better, like, movement profile than these other options. But I wasn't even thinking like, oh, I need it to converge. I'm just like, I know that one's better because I've used it before and I know what it's like, so I'm going to get that one. But these are those little things that it's the context and the nuance, right? Like, is it going to triple your chest gains? No, but let's call it for what it is. Like, words are important. Better is better. And if you have choice, choose something that is better. If you don't have choice, if your gym doesn't have any machines and you live in like a rural area and your options are literally barbell and dumbbell, they're going to be okay, but because you're limited by those options. But if the option is there, choose what is better. And I think like that is effectively our entire argument.
Yeah. I was just on Jordan Lipp's podcast a few days ago. It hasn't come out yet, but we did a tier list, S, then A, B, C, D, of all the different movements across all the different upper body structures. And so we would, choose a movement or a machine or an exercise of some caliber, discuss the exercise, and then place it into one of those 5 categories from top to bottom. And like, to your point, it's the context is always important, because if you're in a gym where all you have is barbells and dumbbells, then any sort of additional chest machine is awesome. You're like, thank God I have something other than barbells and dumbbells to train with. But if you have everything available, then that thing that you were really excited to train with when you just had barbells and dumbbells might not even be the best thing that you want anymore, because you have 7 different options. So the context of what your equipment looks like at whole then defines kind of what would be optimal for you in any given situation.
Spot on. With the barbell bench press, I feel like it's only a matter of time until you run into a joint issue with it, like you said, because you're locked into a fixed pressing motion. Different people, you're going to read different things about like different hand widths, and you're going to experiment, and one might feel better for a while, and that might create a new issue. It's being locked into a plane of motion that isn't going to be the most joint friendly or even joint forgiving. And that's the real issue there.
Yeah. I mean, you can literally take any of the barbell movements that this is feasible for and put D handles on them, and it completely changes my perspective of that movement and its quality. So for whatever that's worth, like just putting D handles onto a barbell and doing rows with it that way would change the movement significantly for me. But okay, let's jump on to barbell deadlifts now. And again, being locked in pronation. So I'll just say that every time, because I think that's really the number one thing to me. But beyond that, a trap bar deadlift, assuming that the handles are not so wide, which does seem to be a problem with a number of trap bars out there. Trap bars are going to allow you to be in a much more natural position for your body to move kind of in the manner that you would want to move while protecting your low back and the other joint structures that you have. So anytime that barbell's in front of your body, you are at some level being pulled into it. And you can deadlift and you can RDL and not have your low back be taxed significantly, for sure. Like, I'm not trying to argue that people haven't been getting great success with those movements for years, but I've also seen a lot more low back injuries through being in pronation and having that bar in front of your body than I have with more neutral grip pulling variations. And then also, just to get off of deadlifts as a movement anyways, like, going back to the fatigue comment that I made, where every of these big 5 barbell movements has a elevated fatigue cost because it's training all of these structures of your body that may or may not even be the target of what you're trying to train. So then this goes back to that idea of, hey, if you're just a time crunched person and you're trying to train as much muscle as you can in as short of a period of time as you can, then the deadlift is a great movement. Like, you can train your upper back, your lower back, traps are part of the upper back. You can even train a little bit of bicep because you're gripping the bar. You can get your glutes and your hamstrings and your quads. And the deadlift is a fantastic movement. If you're an advanced person that's moving a ton of weight on the deadlift, it's likely that you can't do enough volume on the deadlift to elicit the hypertrophy response that you would want in the posterior chain. So choosing a movement like an RDL is going to allow you to put much more stimulus into your glutes and your hamstrings with much less fatigue cost across the rest of the structures of the body, because it's just a little bit more precise. And so, man, the RDL could be considered one of the big 5 to me. And if you put the big 5 RDL in there instead of a conventional deadlift, I think now I'm a little bit more aligned with believing that that's kind of the right path forward for mitigating fatigue and creating stimulus and all that stuff. So thoughts on the conventional or sumo deadlift?
Yeah, everything you said, I think holds true. And again, it's one of those things, especially with the CNS and fatigue cost of the deadlift, once you reach a certain strength proficiency. In the beginning, you do not have that. Just the movement being foreign and you trying to get your chest to rise at an equal rate as your hips is going to be consuming as is in just a basic proficiency movement pattern. But once you get into deadlifting, let's call it, for 315, 405, 495, 3, 4, 5 plates, that fatigue cost is going to rise. And now if we're deadlifting, let's call it 4 plates for 2 to 4 sets of 5 to 6 reps, something like that, you're going to have overlapping fatigue that bleeds itself probably into your quad session, into a hamstring whenever you have that, and potentially even your back session, depending on, let's say you have heavy bent over rows in your back day that's 2 days after your deadlift session, there's going to be an overlapping fatigue cost to that. So it's, again, in the beginning, I think it does work. But as you get stronger, as your program requires more nuance because you have progressed, you will very likely start to run into issues.
Yeah. The deadlift is really a big one because it's just, there's so much fatigue associated with it. And so it's that balance between like getting enough volume for it to be a hypertrophy stimulus and the movement just being stimulative enough at its core. And the deadlift is extremely stimulative, but it's also extremely high fatigue. And so if you're trying to do enough volume to get the hypertrophy stimulus that you desire, it's unlikely to be able to be done through conventional deadlifting or sumo deadlifting. Yeah. All right. So let's move on to, what do you think? A strict overhead press. So again, we have a barbell overhead press movement. I love this movement. It was a core movement of my training for so many years. In the beginning, I went through a version of it where I was doing a seated behind the neck press version. And that was a staple for a couple years. I worked up to some, what I consider to be pretty decent weights on there. I think I was doing 205 for 5 or 6, something like that. Definitely can't do that anymore because I don't train that structure. But then I as I progressed into the CrossFit world, it switched to the standing front military press because that was kind of the strength standard that was used there in CrossFit. Very important to pick out the words strength standard there because, again, barbell basics are great for strength standards, But when it comes to hypertrophy, one of the things that we know about the overhead press, whether it's behind the neck or in front, is that it's going to primarily be a front delt, anterior delt movement. And when we look at the aesthetic of the shoulders, the most aesthetic look is going to have more developed lateral delts, which are going to be these capped ones on the side that allow your frame to look a little bit wider at the top, which then allows it to look a little narrower as you approach the waistline. So it gives you that kind of V taper. And the lateral delts are, I mean, they are trained at the very bottom of the overhead press. So as you move the first few inches of the range of motion, the lateral delt is contributing, but not as much as it is when we're doing abduction, which would be the pushing of the arms out to the side. And so a number of people I've talked to in the industry recently, we've been discussing, the big core movements, and we've flirted with this idea of replacing the overhead press with a lateral raise variation, just because when you're looking at it from a hypertrophy centric focus, a lateral raise is almost a necessity in your program. Like, you just don't see anyone that focuses exclusively on hypertrophy goals that doesn't have different versions of lateral raises in their training. And just like the bench press, the strict overhead press, you're stuck in pronation. Again, it kind of creates some really uncomfortable shoulder sensations for me as it's working through the various ranges of motion of the movement. Switching that to dumbbells and doing a dumbbell overhead press, even at like a slight incline. So I like Cass calls that the anterior delt dumbbell press, where you're at maybe a 70-degree incline and you're doing your overhead presses that way. This allows you to keep your hand rotational, so you're not stuck in that pronated pressing position. And you can also go a little bit wide to narrow, much like you can with the bench press. And we know that the anterior delts also react to that adduction. So going wide to narrow, coming slightly across the body as you go from wide to narrow, is going to be advantageous to the front delts, which is the thing being built by the overhead press. So I think if you're looking to train front delts, using dumbbells or cables or a machine press is likely a better solution, assuming it has handles that are rotational or neutral. And if you're looking to just increase your aesthetic and increase your lateral delt size and strength, you're going to need to have a lateral raise variation in there.
Yeah. The barbell overhead press, it's a movement that I, from a pure enjoyment factor, kept in probably longer than I should have. I should say it was one of the final strength standards that I strived for. And that's the reason I kept it in. Reasons why I don't love it for hypertrophy as much, a rigidity standpoint. The hips can move, the upper back can move a little bit, and whereas if you're using like a dumbbell press, the back's locked in place, so you're not losing force through the thoracic spine, shifting the low back, kind of shifting that sort of thing. And again, like you said, pronation, right? I feel a lot better with a little bit of like a semi pronation grip, right? And maybe not like full neutral, not full pronation, but like about a 45 between that. Just feels much more comfortable for me. I can kind of press through the palm on the outside, which I feel helps me drive a better connection there. And again, I just think it's going to be more comfortable over a longer duration time period, leading to fewer injuries. And if you can train more over a longer period of time because of less injuries, it's plausible that you can achieve a greater amount of hypertrophy because you can achieve a greater amount of volume accumulated, days in the gym, time spent productively.
Yeah. I want to save the rowing one for last because I think there's going to be a lot of more nuance to kind of discuss there. So if we talk about the barbell back squat next, I think the barbell back squat, actually, of like all the movements that we've listed so far, likely has the most applicability to hypertrophy goals, in that it is just a really quality movement that trains your quads and your glutes. The drawbacks of it, because being locked in pronation isn't as significant of a downside in the barbell back squat because it's mostly just hanging out on your back. Like, I still would prefer a safety bar. I think that feels better for most people to be in that kind of front loaded hand position where the bar still sits on your back. But that's neither here nor there. I'm not going to stand on that and try to argue for that super hard. I do think that when it comes to the back squat, that depending on how you perform it makes a huge difference. And so if you're doing a low bar back squat or some more hip dominant version of the back squat where the bar sits a little lower on your back, maybe your torso is leaned forward slightly more, then I actually think that's like a really solid glute exercise. And it's one that I actually have put in programs with clients, in my group programs. And I think it's a great solution. I think it's a slightly less great solution for the quad structure. It can be manipulated to be good for the quads by elevating the heels, really driving the knees forward, keeping the torso upright so that the hips stay underneath the torso the whole time, which is really the opposite structure of how you would perform that low bar kind of glute dominant back squat. The problem with the quad dominant version of the back squat is really just that as you fatigue, if you're not super seasoned back squatter, you will tend to fatigue by letting your hips shoot up and your torso come forward. So the question then becomes, are you stimulating the quads fully, or when the quads are beginning to fail, are you then just shifting that tension into the glutes, low back region and the hips and allowing them to take over? And if you're doing that, like, it could be argued that that's not even that bad, because you're like, well, I took my quads to failure and then I'm taking my hips and glutes to failure. So it's like a double whammy, boom, two things, right? The downside to that is just that increased fatigue cost that we talked about with the deadlift. So now you're taking a movement that's supposed to finish when your quads fatigue, but you're taking it to the point that it's not just fatiguing your quads, it's now fatiguing your midline, your low back, your glutes and things like that along the way. And so now it's not as directed of a stimulus, which is fine, maybe, but it is causing significantly more fatigue, which will then have carryover into like your other movements. And if you're a hypertrophy seeker, then you're going to want to just be a little bit more precise in that setup and execution.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add there. The one thing I think is important is you're either built to barbell back squat or you're not, and I think how you have your relationship with it probably depends on that there. I have a very short torso relative to my femurs. I'm not built to barbell back squat, and I have incredible ankle dorsiflexion capabilities, right? My chest is forward. It's a lot of hip, low back. And I tried, and you know this, Brian, for years and years and years, I tried to get as much as I could out of a traditional barbell back squat. My glutes fucking grew. My adductors grew. My quads were pathetic. And it wasn't until I was finally able to break away from the 2010s era of thinking, or early 2000s, I should probably say, was I able to finally get really good quad development by removing my ego and emotional attachment to a barbell lift.
Yep. Just a big plug here for back supported squat machines. It just like, there's just no reason, if you're trying to train your quads, there just is no reason to keep the degrees of freedom there in your hip structure and allow your low back to contribute to that movement. If you want to train your quads, at some point, you're going to have to use a back supported squat machine or a leg press or something along those lines. And then I think this is also the only place really to include a brief discussion on the leg extension machine, because if you're focusing on the big five exclusively, then you are training the 3 quad muscles other than the rec fem. And because the rec fem crosses the hip, which is the big muscle that runs from the hip into the knee across the front of the thigh, if you are not training isolated knee extension like you would in a sissy squat or a leg extension machine, then you're actually missing out on the growth of the biggest quad muscle that literally makes your quads have the shape that most people training for hypertrophy would want. So definitely a good reason to at least include leg extensions in your program, even if you're also including back squats or whatever else in there.
Yeah.
All right. So the last one, barbell row. Do you want to talk about this one first?
Yeah. And I mean, to be completely honest, this is the one of the 5 that I will still use sometimes. I think there's a number of reasons why it lends itself a little bit more differently to some of the others. We still run into all those same issues with the fixed, the locked into pronation, hand width, that sort of thing. But it's, for me, in my structures, right, that I just recently talked about, it fits pretty decently. I can get a decent stimulus out of. I've been able to remove my ego from the number of plates loaded on it. And I can get a good amount out of it now. 10, 12 years ago, that's not the case. I fucking hated them, right? So this one, for me personally, I use 5 to 10 times more than anything else. But again, it fits me anatomically, and that is probably a large contributing factor to that statement.
Yeah. That's interesting. I don't love it, and that's primarily, well, I guess it's primarily for the pronation, but it's also for the nature of being bent over in that movement and the additional stress that puts on the system as a whole. So my first way to improve that movement would be to use D handles, but you're still bent over. So the second way to improve that movement for me would be to be chest supported. So this is actually extremely easy to implement too. Probably easier with dumbbells than with a barbell, but I've seen it done with barbells too, where you just put the incline bench, at a 30-ish degree angle. You drape yourself over the top of it. If you're a female, you might stuff up a sweatshirt to put an ab mat there to make things a little more comfortable for you. And by being chest supported, we're taking all of that stress off of the low back structure, and we're making sure that there's no momentum either. So you're decreasing total fatigue cost to your system. We know the low back is a point of high sensitivity when it comes to systemic fatigue, and we're decreasing momentum, which then allows you to actually know when you're failing that you're failing because your pulling structure is fatigued and not because you're systemically fatigued or you've used momentum to a point where you just can't use more momentum. There's just less variance in the diagnostic process. Beyond those two issues, relying just on the bent over barbell row limits the ability of some of the more precise nature of directing back work using elbow position and pull line. And anyone that's listened to our podcast before knows that we talk about this a lot. But if you're in pronation or semi-pronation, you naturally are going to have your elbows travel out, say abduct away from the body as you pull. So you can think about this in any movement, whether it's a bent over barbell row, a pronated pull-up, a pronated row of any kind. You can't actually row and keep your elbows in tight to your body. They're inevitably going to flare out a little bit at the short position as the bar approaches your chest. When that happens, it actually decreases or eliminates in some ways the contribution of the lats, because the lats do this humeral depression where the elbow is driving in and down toward the waistline. As the elbows go out, the lats turn off. A lot of that stimulus goes into the upper back, which is totally fine. We need to train the upper back. The upper back is a large contributor to the aesthetic appeal of the back in general. But one of the big calamities that we have noticed over the last few decades, as people focus too much on these big barbell basics, is they lack lat development, especially lower lat development. And so again, you could include the pull-up. I think that helps solve the problem a bit. But really, if we want to target the lats and specifically the lower mid-lat structures, we need to use something that allows us to direct our elbow in super tight to our waistline. That involves the depression of that where we're pulling down as that's occurring. So you could think neutral grip pull-ups. If you did like a shoulder width, narrow type neutral grip pull-up, great. That at least gets you partially there. Because the lats actually stretch around the rib cage, much like the pecs do. We talked about how important it is to converge when you're doing a chest press if you want to hit the short position of the chest. The opposite is true in pulling, in that if you can start with the arm across the body, like you would finish a chest press, so you start with the arm coming across the body, that pre-stretches the lat. So now as you kind of do that almost bow and arrow type pull thing, where the elbow comes in down to the side and comes from across the body, we're able to engage more stimulus to the lat. So maybe this is relevant for you in your training journey. Maybe it's not. Maybe doing bent over rows and pull-ups is totally fine for you at this time. Maybe you reach a point in your journey where those aren't fine. And for you to continue to build your back, you're going to just need to be a little bit more precise with your selection of exercises and the way that you execute them.
Very, very wonderfully put. And one thing I thought was very funny when you were describing, we bought a seal row for the gym for that very reason. So we can get rows. We have the cambered bar. It's great. It
That's
removes
awesome.
all those
I love
issues.
that.
Yep. And I bought the explode pull down for that very reason, like joint freedom. You can pull in, like, and it's like we've been talking about, when you understand what the target is of hypertrophy and the different elbow positions and things like that, there's just better movements out there for you to have a more complete approach to physique development. But I don't want this to come off as we're saying, like, if the options are the big five or never work out, that never working out is a better option. That's obviously not the case, but there will be a point in almost every person's, pursuit of this, if you will put enough time into that pursuit because you deem it worthy, that you will largely graduate from at least 3, I would say 2 of these, because they no longer serve your purpose as well as other things could.
Yeah, no, it's really well said. I think that it's important to reiterate that I very much feel like the big 5 or the big 7 is the way that pretty much everybody should start their training journey, and they should probably stick with them until those movements aren't serving them anymore. So it was somewhat upsetting to me to see the negativity in the post in the Mind Pump group discussing this, because we really weren't able to provide this context and nuance in that answer in April, because it was a 2 to 3 minute answer. And it wasn't even actually asking about our thoughts on Mind Pump and the big 5. It was actually asking about strength standards for hypertrophy. And I threw in that comment at the end about Mind Pump and the big 5 because it was on the front of my brain for whatever reason. But like, I don't hate on the big 5 at all globally as far as tools that you can use to help your training journey. It's just that each of those movements of the big 5, it feels like a hammer when you're talking about tools. Like, it really feels as if, hey, I'm trying to be time efficient. Lifting or hypertrophy is not my number one goal. I just want to get in, get a really good stimulus, build some muscle, be strong, etc. Those movements are 100% the tool for that job. As you become more advanced, the need for more tools likely changes. Like, you probably need a needle nose plier for something along your journey in construction of your body, right? So that's for sure one important piece. The idea of being locked in pronation is just something that I think over time is going to become an issue for everybody. And it's really just a matter of when that occurs. So you might be someone now who's a few years into your journey. Maybe you're even 10 or 15 years in and you're like, well, the barbell basics are still serving me. Then I just say, like, great, continue using them if that's what is the tool that's doing the job for you and helping you get to the goals that you have. But just don't be so committed to the big 5 that you continue to push them even after they're not serving you anymore, because that's how we end up getting, elbow tendonitis, overuse injuries, AC joint discomfort in the shoulder. Just a number of different things downstream from being locked in pronation. So, the big 5 are great. Like, use them until there's something that serves you better. That would be the way I'd probably conclude that.
Yeah. And I would imagine the follow-up questions we're going to get is like, well, how do I know? How many years? When does it happen? I don't think there is. And because it's too contextual, right? You might be perfectly built to barbell bench press, and with your AC joint and how the angles are, it works for you. Keep it in forever. If you never have shoulder or elbow joint issues from that pronation, keep it in. It might be built for you. The odds are it probably is not, right? And I think that there's, again, the example I think that was really good is when you were talking about using like a pull down and keeping that elbow in tight. If you're taking like a 17-year-old who's been in the gym for 2 weeks and you're trying to teach them that. And if you feel that lat activation when you're doing that, they're going to be like, what? I don't know what muscle that is, right? You need to spend enough time building something, the muscle, and providing a general stimulus in the general direction for you to help identify the connection with it and that sort of thing. Whereas like now for me, I can just think about it, right? And like flex my elbow a little bit and that lat is there. When I was 17, I couldn't, it wasn't even on the realm of possibility sort of thing. So again, it's like everyone's going to be on a different timeline and you're just going to have to take a little bit of individual accountability and feel your way through things. And then you'll kind of know once your body starts getting angry with you in some of these things, or you deviate a little bit, or you train in a different gym on a trip or whatever, and you're on a pendulum squat for the first time, and you do your 2 sets, and your quads are completely pumped and full of stimulus, and you're like, holy shit, I never get this, back home when I'm squatting. Maybe it's time to start exploring a little bit, right? But it's everyone's a different time schedule on that.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I actually want to add one other quick thing, which is the intellectual curiosity piece of moving beyond the big five. Because at some point, I mean, I like maybe some people are able to just kind of live in the monotony of the sameness each week and just literally try to progress as they can over time with the same 5 or 10 basic movements. For me, I reached a point where I was just mentally, aside from physically, I was mentally worn out on those movements as well. And by beginning to explore and incorporate some of these more nuanced exercises in, I realized that, holy shit, I'm getting an insane stimulus. I'm enjoying the prospect of exploration, which is increasing my enjoyment of lifting in general and making me look forward to going to the gym. And on top of that, my body feels amazing. And a lot of the limitations and joint structure issues that I was having when focusing on the big barbell basics literally dissipated. And my body began feeling 10 years younger as a result of training more with cables and machines. So nothing wrong with the big five, but it's probably worth exploring beyond that at some point in your journey. And, when that point is very individual.
Very, very well put. So hopefully this episode was helpful, guys. As always, any questions or follow-ups, ping either of us on Instagram, and we'll talk to you next week.